to this day point out to you where Africa was underdeveloped as a result of what they are calling the Arab slave trade. I mean, when I say that the Arab slave trade is a polemic invented by British missionaries and parliament during the 18th century, 1700s, I'm not saying that there was not an Arab slave trade. I'm saying that the Arab slave trade, as we come to understand it, as being the Arab equivalent and the precursor to Atlantic slave trade, is historically false. Everything people say about the Arab slave trade comes from British missionaries and colonizers during the modern period, starting from 1700s, with people like David Livingstone, Henry Morton Stanley, and Samuel Baker, to name a few. These men were Christian missionaries who wanted to spread Christianity in East Africa, the areas of Djibouti, Guinea, Kenya, and such. But as I said, they couldn't sell that. They couldn't sell the idea to British Parliament on the basis of religion alone. And because of the geography of East Africa and it's suitable for agriculture, it became a target for colonization. And just like before the major scramble in Africa in the 1800s, there was this sort of scramble for East Africa where you had the British and the Portuguese sort of dueling it out. But, others have pointed out what is problematic with this appellation of the Arab slave trade because it obfuscates the history. Like I said, there is an Arab slave trade, but it's not nice and neat to study. You can't name a source on the Arab slave trade that is not highly political and polemical and polarizing. Walter Rodney, those of you who don't know, was the sort of Pan-Africanist and Marxist who wrote the book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. He wrote in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, that the term Arab slave trade is a historical misnomer since bilateral trade agreements between a myriad of ethnic groups across the proposed Zanj trade network characterized much of the acquisition process of chattel and more often than not indentured servants. That I said you don't find the Arab slave trade in indigenous East African sources because they saw themselves as autonomous actors in this commercial relationship with the people to the east. So there was no need to sort of, signify this as some devastating event that is happening to them the way Afrocentrists are making it out to be. Rodney also writes in the same book, the slave trade on the Indian Ocean, because he paused there. What people are calling the Arab slave trade in East Africa was actually the Indian Ocean trade. And it predates the Arabs by 2,500 years or more. So before the Arabs were even a thing, you had this commercial relationship between the East Bantu people and the Shona people and the people in the Indian subcontinent region. It goes all the way back to ancient Harappa, which is the first recorded Indian civilization or Indian society. He says East Africa, the slave trade on the Indian Ocean has been called the East African slave trade and the Arab slave trade for so long that it hides the extent to which it was also a European slave trade. When the slave trade from East Africa was at its height in the 18th century, this is when David Livingstone and the others are conceiving of this idea of bringing Christianity to East Africa, but then have to sell it to Parliament. He says, at its height in the 18th century and in the early 19th century, the destination of most captives was the European-owned plantation economies of Mauritius, Reunion, and as well as the Americas via the Cape of Good Hope. Besides African laboring as slaves in certain Arab countries in the 18th and 19th centuries, were all ultimately serving the European capitalist system, which set up a demand for slave-grown products such as the clothes grown in Zanzibar under the supervision of Arab masters. So the slave trade, the Arab slave trade, as it is popularly understood, was conceived as British colonialist propaganda.
Mm-mm-mm. We've talked about a number of different subjects. We touched on these things, and this has been very enlightening. So, I'm sure it's enlightening to the audience. And you've said some things that, have been enlightening to me. Just one more point on this last subject that we just got done talking about. I would think if there was a such thing, if the Arab slave trade was comparable to the Atlantic slave trade, wouldn't we see Arab superpowers?
Yes, we don't. Two things. One, we don't see any sub-Saharan African land except Sudan, which is a separate category. That has a separate history because Sudan was tied into what was going on in North Africa between the Persian and Roman Empire.
Okay.
People don't Nubia was. But we don't find anywhere in sub-Saharan West Africa, for example, where, Arabic is the first language.
Okay.
In the same way that, people speak Arabic, don't get me wrong, of course they
Yeah.
speak Arabic, in the way that you have French and English,
Yeah.
which is not customary for people who've been colonized. Two, where is the Arab wealth from slavery during the Arab slave trade?
Because
If the Arab slave trade took place for as long as it did, and it was as brutal as it was, and it depopulated Africa to the extent that it did, where's the evidence of it today in the Arabian Peninsula?
well,
This is the question. Malcolm answered the question when he was confronted
okay.
with it.
Okay.
So, no one has ever described in detail how the Arab slave trade arrested the development of Africa with the kind of detail that you can do when taking the transatlantic slave trade and pointing out how it has undermined the sovereignty of African nations. No one's been able to do that with the Arabs. In fact, during the time that they say the Arab slave trade was happening, Africans on both coasts were at their zenith.
Mm.
Even Chancellor Williams admits in his book where he wrote, the Renaissance in Africa occurred at a time it developed in Europe between the 15th and 16th century, and that both in Europe and Africa, Islamic sources were the catalyst. So at the same time, you're attributing Africa's last Renaissance to Islam, you're also saying that it's responsible for the destruction of African
And I
civilization.
mentioned that earlier. It seems like it's like a dichotomy going on. Like it doesn't make sense to me. It's almost like people are as a polemic where people, depending on who you're speaking to and what you're speaking about, you'll say one thing, and if you're speaking to another group of people and it's a different subject, you'll say something the complete opposite of what you said in another venue. Whatever it takes to make your point.
Absolutely.
And just to touch on the Arab wealth thing, I've heard people say, well, we need to go after the Arab nations for reparations the same way we're going after United States and some other Western nations for this reparations. But when I look at North Africa, there's no superpower in North Africa. There's no this great wealth that you could get, that you can trace back to an Arab slave trade or a Saharan slave trade that you can get reparations for. the same thing even on the Arabian continent. There is great wealth on the Arabian continent, but that came within our modern era with the discovery of oil. You touched on this in your book. You can't
Right.
attribute that to slavery, and you made that this distinction between a slave nation and nations that have slavery. But even Kemet had slavery. You know, the ancient Egyptians had slavery. West Africans and East African indigenous people had slavery. Dahomey tribe. I read about the Dahomey tribe, which is the subject of one of the recent movies, The Woman King, that came out last year or so. And the controversy over that movie, because there was a tribe that engaged in slavery and enslavement, and has some connection with the with European slavers as well.